Hello, I'm Vladimir Rubinsky, professor and director of Laboratory for Politics and International Relations, a point at SS University in Cali, Colombia. Today's program is about historical memories, urban spaces, and we rather provocatively decided to call it how to get rid of the status. But we will discuss it today if we should get rid of the status after all. And we are very lucky to have with us today Professor Dr. Blair RUBLE, at this moment a distinguished fellow at Woodrow Wilson International Center of Scholars, where I had myself a pleasure to be a fellow back in 2016. And Dr. RUBLE has a very impressive academic career. He dedicated a lot of his time in the academy studying actually urban spaces, and also, as far as I know, and please correct me on this, you also had a lot of experience doing research in the Soviet Union, still when it was the Soviet Union. So maybe somehow we saw each other back then, but
maybe
you never know. As I was telling you before we started the program, the idea for us is to talk about some developments outside of Colombia, and then to try to understand how we can learn, or what kind of lessons we can learn from those developments for us here in Colombia. And therefore, my first question to you, if you can tell us a little bit about your research experience in these topics, urban spaces, historical memories, perhaps you witnessed or you know something about the status in the past.
Sure. Actually, my research interest began to develop when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I, from beginning around 1988, well into the 1990s, I worked on questions of public presentation of memory. And I did my own research on public space in the city of Yaroslavl in Russia. And I worked with a number of specialists from Eastern Europe who were looking at the process of renaming, of reorienting monuments. And perhaps that gives me a slightly different view on the American situation at present. Secondly, more recently, I've been involved in the urban history of Washington, D.C., which very much has always revolved around very complex issues of race relations. And there has long been differing views on how the history is represented in public space. And we obviously have big national monuments, but there have been discussions all along about what should be named for whom, when, where, and so on and so forth. And finally, this is more of a personal note, but my father's family came from the American South and fought in the Civil War. So I have relatives who view somehow the presentation of the Confederacy as an important element of American history. So I've come at this from several different directions, all of which are coming together right now. I think that clearly the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis was so horrific that it caused American society, many elements of American society who never thought about these things, to actually stop and begin to reflect on our own history. And simultaneously, there had been a movement to take down Confederate statues in particular for some time. There was a very violent confrontation over a statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, Virginia, right after Trump became president. Also, the previous mayor of New Orleans took down 4 major Confederate statues in New Orleans and was subject to death threats. The situation never turned violent, and Mayor Landrieu was very articulate about why these statues need to come down. But the point I'm trying to make is the issue of the memory of the Confederacy has been simmering for some time, stoked in part by the rise of Donald Trump, whose politics merged nicely with memories of a Confederacy that, in my mind, never existed. So all of these things come together, and with people at home, because of the COVID outbreak, the spark that ignited a number of trends right now in American society was the murder of George Floyd. But that's the immediate cause, the spark. But a lot of these issues have been out there for a long time.
You know, I want to make a confession, because when I first came to the United States, during, as part of one of the first and the last one, Texan-Soviet exchange program, it was back in 1990. And before we went to Texas, which per se was kind of experience for us, you know, Texas is Texas. And for someone from the Soviet Union, especially from Siberia, I'm original from Siberia, it was a very, very much contrast. I think that was the whole idea of it. But the organizer took us for a couple of days first to Washington, D.C. And I clearly remember now that one of the first impressions and first food for thoughts for me, what's so different in the United States back then, was precisely seeing the statue, I think, of Robert Lee in Arlington Cemetery, if I'm not mistaken. And I thought for myself, how it's possible? I mean, those are the losers. They lost the Civil War. How they can have these statues for them? And this, I think, was the first encounter with these experiences. And now I'm thinking, why it is statues? Why this is the kind of monuments that really people got upset with? What do you think? Because it's also happening in Russia.
It's very interesting. I, even though I grew up in New York, I attended the University of North Carolina. I have Southern members of my family. I would go to the South, and I would see statues. Last summer, a statue of a Confederate soldier was torn down in the University of North Carolina campus. The statue was always just there. I never really thought about it. But over the last 5 to 10 years, as pressure has grown to remove these statues, there's been more information coming about how they appeared in the first place. Okay. And it's a really interesting story, because they didn't start appearing until the 1890s, early 1900s. And the North won the Civil War but lost the peace. And in 1877, there was a compromise which determined the outcome of a presidential election, and a deal was made, which basically we will let I think it was a Democrat become president, and in return, the military occupation of the southern states by the North would end. And what happened then was the systematic effort by those who had lost the Civil War to claim local power. And they created a myth of the lost cause, which was basically, we were right, we were gentlemen. It wasn't really about slavery, it was about a way of life, it was about states' rights. And Robert E. Lee was a much better general than any of the Northern generals. And they created this whole myth of how wonderful the South was before the Civil War. And even the slaves were happy. And if you go back and look at American popular culture, you see echoes of this. And the placement of the statues, I forget the number, but there are a couple of thousand statues across the US still. That was a very purposeful effort to kind of substantiate this myth. And essentially, this was accompanied by the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It was accompanied by so-called Jim Crow segregation. It was all part of a package by which the South actually reclaimed the higher ground from the North. And that was about 100 years ago. Then when the Civil Rights Movement began, the Confederate battle flag started to reappear on southern states as part of their symbols. It had disappeared, but it came back as a symbol of white supremacy and the Jim Crow structure. So when people start talking about, oh, the Confederate flag, it actually had completely disappeared and only made a comeback in the fights over civil rights legislation during and school desegregation in the 1960s. So all of this has, as all public symbols in public space are, it's been highly manipulated. But that helps to answer how it is that people who were traitors to the country have these statues all over the place. And because the story was rewritten that they weren't the traitors, they actually sustained this ideal notion of what the country was before.
Yes, I mean, in the case of the United States, it's now very clear the how the process. I mean, the how the statues and why so many statues. But in other places, like you're an expert on the Soviet Union and Russia. You know that from time to time, and I would say often again, there are voices, for example, to put back the statue of Dzerzhinsky in the Lubyanka Square, the guy who is, of course, is known for being responsible for killing so many innocent people. And I think that was the first statues to fall down when the Soviet Union was disappearing, right, because it was so important symbol. So I think that the statues has this kind of magic power, you know, to be the direct reference to some very important and emotionally charged things.
Statues become a physical manifestation of emotions and values. And which statues you have up say a lot about who you are or who you want aspire to be. And we can, well, it's obvious looking at Russian politics, there are many, many, many Russians who agree with their president that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragic historic error. And one way of demonstrating that is to recreate the symbols of Soviet power. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that because nostalgia, there's a heavy dose of nostalgia involved, and people remember the way things were when they were younger, and as they get older, they're not quite sure why things have to change. And because I remember I was involved in, when I was going to Yaroslavl in the early 1990s, there was a discussion about whether or not to take down the central Lenin statue. And the city did public opinion polls, and the vast majority didn't want the statue taken down. But then there were follow-up questions as to why, and it was because this is where people met when they were teenagers. It was in the central focus in the city. It was a gathering point. It had no political meaning at all. It had another kind of emotional meaning. And it's like the statue of the Confederate soldier at the University of North Carolina I mentioned before. It was where it was on the entrance to campus. If you're meeting somebody, oh, you'll meet by Silent Sam, he was called because his rifle never fired. And it was just part of student life. It was divorced from what the meaning was. And that's the pernicious connection.
Yeah. May I ask you a kind of a different question? Can you hear me? Sorry? Do we have a connection?